I come to you with a message of leave-taking and farewell.
For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence.
Our military organization today bears little relation to that known of any of my predecessors in peacetime, or indeed by the fighting men of World War II or Korea.
It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine.
We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions
that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
Its preparations are concealed, not published.
The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes.
Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised.
Deadly riots breaking out in Greece over the government's plan to avoid defaulting on its loans. You see, Greece is out of money, and it's turning to the European Union for big loans. But the European Union says no, not unless you get your cash situation under control. So now they're making cutbacks in spending and raising taxes, and that has led to riots. And this crisis is having an effect not just in Greece, not just in Europe, but across the globe, including right here at home. There are bigger concerns. It could get worse here in America. Joining me now, somebody who has thoughts on this and who has warned about it. That's Texas Congressman Ron Paul. Congressman, thanks so much for being back with us. You've had your eye on Greece for a while now. This probably comes as no surprise to you.
No, not at all. And I think this is just the opening of a much more serious crisis than the financial crisis. I think what we're seeing is a shift from the financial crisis, the financial institutions, to a currency crisis. Even though the dollar is up sharply today and has been up sharply last week, I see this as an attack on the dollar. Because in terms of gold, the dollar has been rapidly devalued. And this means that gold is acting as money. They're giving up on the paper currencies. And I think this country and the world is in for big trouble because this is a currency crisis and it's much worse than having a financial crisis.
You know, they say that, look, okay, what's happening in Greece is one thing. But if this expands to Europe, and they're saying Portugal could be next, the German chancellor says she's very worried and that the European has to bail out Greece because she's worried about it spreading to Europe. And there are other countries that could follow, Spain and others. If this becomes a European problem, it very much becomes an American problem as well, does it not?
There's no doubt about it. It is a world problem, and we're going to be the last one to fall, but because we have the dollar, and people still think the dollar will save everybody, and the dollar is going to have to bail out California and so many other problems that we have here. But that's going to make the whole world vulnerable. And it's a debt explosion. It has occurred for 40 years. We've known it has been building. We knew it couldn't last. And we knew it would end first with a financial bubble collapsing, and now we're in the midst of a currency crisis.
You know, it's really scary to see what can happen in a society when the overspending comes home to roost, you know, when you see the consequences of years and years of overspending. Obviously, people here are very worried about our debt and our deficit. Congressman Paul, could this kind of thing happen here? Could what we're seeing in Greece and California happen on a nationwide basis here?
Absolutely, and there's going to be anger and there's going to be riots in the streets as well. But this is all a consequence of the fact that why and how do governments spend like this? It's because they don't have sound money. When we run up deficits, we tax, but never enough. We can't tax, it would ruin the economy. Then we borrow, and we get away with that for a long time. But we rely on the printing presses from the Federal Reserve to create the money, and that's where the problem is. This is why we have to look at the Federal Reserve. We have to get an audit of the Federal Reserve. We have to look at the monetary system and the dollar system, because you can't have fake money. This is counterfeit.
So in my opinion, and this is important to understand in terms of your investment allocation, in my opinion, for as far as the eye can see, the Federal Reserve will never again implement tight monetary policies. They will print and print and print. And of course, it will not always work, but the point is they cannot really afford to have a debt deflation in a credit-addicted economy. So they're going to print, and that will have implications on the value of different asset classes, and of course also on the long-term value of paper money or the US dollar specifically.
Look, I was there when the Secretary and the Chairman of the Federal Reserve came those days and talked with members of Congress about what was going on. It was about September 15th. Here's the facts, and we don't even need to talk about these things. On Thursday at about 11 o'clock in the morning, the Federal Reserve noticed a tremendous drawdown of money market accounts in the United States to the tune of $550 billion was being drawn out in a matter of an hour or two. The Treasury opened up its window to help. They pumped $105 billion in the system and quickly realized that they could not stem the tide. We were having an electronic run on the banks. They decided to close the operation, close down the money accounts, and announce a guarantee of $250,000 per account so there wouldn't be further panic out there. And that's what actually happened. If they had not done that, their estimation was that by 2 o'clock that afternoon, $5.5 trillion would have been drawn out of the money market system of the United States, would have collapsed the entire economy of the United States, and within 24 hours, the world economy would have collapsed. Now, we talked at that time about what would happen if that happened. It would have been the end of our economic system and our political system as we know it. And that's why, when they made the point, we've got to act and do things quickly, we did.
Many of us were told in private conversations that if we voted against this bill on Monday, that the sky would fall, the market would drop 2,000 or 3,000 points the first day, another couple thousand the second day, and a few members were even told that there would be martial law in America if we voted no.
They saw the banking system at the brink of collapse. In order to keep it functional, to keep depositors safe, they basically did whatever they had to do in the way of making money, creating money, to keep the system afloat. They've kept the system afloat, but there's a cost to that, and that's inflation.
Now, you actually reckon that now we've had all this stimulus and stimulus coming along, you foresee quite large inflation. Give me your outlook, maybe 3-4 years out into the future.
Well, 3-4 years out into the future, I think we could be in a hyperinflation.
Because this is going to unleash rampant inflation around the world, rampant confusion in the currency markets, and you're going to have currencies gyrating all over the world. Bond markets are going to start to collapse, and then we're going to have a real problem. And that's why the stock market understands this. They're unleashing a inflationary holocaust, and because they don't know what else to do. They're making mistakes.
John, thanks for joining us. I have to tell you, I've been reading your reports here, and I feel the distinct need to start building a bomb shelter and hoarding canned goods. I mean, you really don't pull any punches here. You call for nothing less than the Great Collapse. Can you tell us what that is and what it looks like?
Well, eventually it's going to be a hyperinflationary Great Depression in the United States. I'm not looking for a hyperinflation in Canada. The hyperinflation in the United States is due to really decades of extraordinary fiscal abuse. If you look at the government's financial statements on a generally accepted accounting principle basis, what you'll see is that the annual deficit is running $4 to $5 trillion a year. That includes the year-to-year change in the net present value of the unfunded liabilities for Social Security and Medicare.
Over the last 10 years, actually, the big deficit were the unfunded liabilities that went up. And so the government debt with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and General Motors and so forth, and the unfunded liabilities, is more like 600% of GDP. Then you add the 250% of GDP private credit, then you get something like 800% debt to GDP. I tell you, sovereign credits in the Western world, they're all bankrupt. But before they officially go bankrupt and can't pay, they're going to print money, and massively so. That should be very clear, because that's the easiest way politically to postpone the hour of truth. You postpone the problem to the next president or to the next party or whatever it is, and that, I think, should be very clear.
You know, also, the government was revising their forecast on when the Social Security trust funds that don't actually exist are going to run out of money. And now they've claimed that we're going to run out of assets in the Social Security Trust Fund by 2037, which is 5 years sooner than they thought before. But the reality is the Social Security Trust Funds have no assets. They don't even exist. There's nothing in there. The only thing in the Social Security Trust Fund is a government bond. But that's the same thing as having no trust fund at all. That would be like me setting up a trust fund for myself, and so I write myself a check for $1 million and put it in my trust fund. And I claim my uncashed check as an asset. This is nonsense. Government bonds are assets if I own them, but they're not an asset if the government owns them, because it's also the government liability. The real key for Social Security is not when the trust funds run out of phony government bonds, but when does the Social Security Trust Fund begin paying out more money than it takes in. Right now, the government collects more in Social Security taxes than it spends in Social Security payments. The date where that turns into a negative, where the Social Security surplus becomes a deficit, according to the government, is now 2017 or 2016, 1 year sooner than the 2017 they originally forecast. But of course, all these government forecasts are based on unrealistically rosy economic assumptions regarding growth and tax revenues. It'd be my guess that the Social Security program runs a deficit a lot sooner than 2016, maybe 2012, which is right around the corner given that this is 2009. And what the problem there is, now the government is going to have to move into the market and sell bonds. You know, in the past, the deficit has appeared smaller. We've made it smaller by using this Social Security Trust Fund to make the deficit seem smaller. But now, when Social Security itself runs a deficit, now the budget deficit is going to be increased by the Social Security deficit instead of shrunk by the Social Security surplus. And that is the real problem. That's when this gigantic Ponzi scheme really comes to an end. Because that's when the government has to admit there's not enough money.
Putting that in perspective, a $5 trillion deficit can't be covered by taxes. The government could take 100% of everyone's income, corporate profits, they'd still be in deficit. They could also cut every penny of government spending except for Medicare and Social Security, and they'd be in deficit. Those programs have to be reduced. There's no political will in Washington to do so. You just saw the response to the president's deficit commission, which primarily was aimed at the cash-based deficit, getting that down to around the reported $200 billion that they've had in recent years. It's not really addressing the gap-based deficit, which is the one that ultimately has us bankrupt. Because over time, unable to raise the taxes, most governments, they don't default on their debt. What they do is they rev up the printing presses and create the money to pay off the obligations. That would have doomed us to a hyperinflation by the end of this decade, but then the crisis of the last couple of years has brought in the problem much closer. we've seen extraordinary actions taken to prevent the system from collapsing. With the Fed, with the U.S. Treasury creating and spending whatever money they had to do to keep the banking system from collapsing, to keeping the financial system from collapsing.
Okay.
It's held things stable, but the economy's still turning down. The solvency crisis is getting worse. The Fed is already into quantitative easing too, and we're beginning to see the effect of inflation from that. And that will eventually evolve into a hyperinflation.
The question is, when will they again print money, and when will government credit again exceed private credit growth contraction? I think it will happen, but some people disagree with me. But in any event, what I'd like to really emphasize, for us to make any forecast how the world will look like in 3 or 5 years, beyond saying it's going to be a roller coaster ride, is impossible. We don't know. That is for sure, but it will be a roller coaster.
Prashant, I expect to see social unrest, civil unrest in the United States a couple of years from now. Yes, it's changing the entire situation in the United States. The United States is the largest debtor nation in the history of the world.
If someone had shown me the picture of a burning Bangkok a year ago, I would have said, I don't believe it. But it happened. Sometimes political events and regulatory changes and social conditions can have a huge impact on asset markets.
There is a dramatic sea change taking place. The world's center is moving from the west to the east, to Asia, and many people have not figured this out yet, especially people in the United States. No, you're going to see a lot of turmoil in the United States in the next 3, 4, 5 years.
All of you have to allocate a larger portion of your assets to emerging economies. I'm not saying that you have to do it tomorrow, because I think that we have a lot of social issues that are still impending, and a lot of problems will still occur. But in general, that would be my idea, to shift assets gradually overseas, and also to have the custody of assets overseas. Because one day you won't be able to get your money out of the jurisdiction you're in. That should be very clear. I'm not only talking about the US there.
And I've been warning too about capital controls, that they're coming, and this is kind of, you know, the camel's nose under the tent. What this new bill does is it basically says that if foreign banks open up an account for an American citizen, they have to disclose to the US government all the information about those individuals. And if that conflicts with their laws, as it would in a country like Switzerland, then we're requiring those foreign entities to close those accounts and send the money back. In addition, there was a provision that said that the banks, if there is a withdrawal from an American from a foreign account, that the banks need to withhold 30% of the withdrawal and send it to the US government. So this is it. I mean, this is what's going on, and I expect more and more of these types of capital control legislation to be passed without any fanfare, especially once the dollar ultimately starts to collapse, which I think it will. And when that happens, and more Americans are looking to protect themselves from a weakening dollar, from domestic inflation, by investing abroad, by acquiring foreign assets or foreign currencies, I think these exchange controls or capital controls are going to be much more interfering. But at some point in the future, what might happen is that the government actually implements controls just on buying foreign currencies or buying foreign stocks. Either they forbid it outright, or they impose all kinds of fines and fees that unnecessarily raise the costs of these transactions.
Agricultural commodities are now very depressed. They're probably the most attractive commodities longer term. And as always, I would continue to accumulate some gold. I don't think that gold will always go up, and that meaningful corrections cannot occur, but we have to distinguish between smart guys who know how to trade and buy at the low and sell at the high, like Goldman Sachs, that had a profit in every single trading day in the first quarter of this year. Simple people like me prefer to just hold some gold. Because I'm mindful the central bankers are going to print money, no matter they have no other option. And when it doesn't help, the economy will tank.
After these kind of catastrophic collapses, sometimes they're followed by war.
But the point I really like to make is the Chinese, yes, they have access to the East and South China Sea here, but they're surrounded by American military and naval bases, and the US has 11 aircraft carriers. The Chinese don't have one, whereby the Chinese have very efficient submarines that can probably sink them all. But yeah, I mean, this is new war techniques. But essentially, it should be clear that it's not in the interest of the Chinese to have American bases here, because then they are really encircled with the Americans, with the American bases here in the Pacific. So I think that tensions will go up. The Russians, by the way, have no interest to have American bases here because they're also encircled by America. And over time, I think the tensions will go up. By the way, the Chinese have a long border here with Central Asia, with Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, even a small border with Afghanistan, Pakistan. And I think eventually it will come to war. In war times, you want to own commodities, physical. Of course, not paper money and derivatives at UBS and Citigroup. And, but physical, because during war times, along the Kondratiev, when prices go up, tensions increase, prices then go ballistic. Napoleonic Wars, Civil War, then World War I, and then Vietnam. So this is something to consider. The other thing to consider is obviously how will the next war look like? For the last 5,000 years of human history, cities offered safety. I think now the countryside will offer safety. You have to have a house in the middle of nowhere. Nobody will drop a bomb on you. Whereas in the cities, they'll poison the water, switch off the electricity, the internet, your credit card. You won't even get home. You have quarantines because you will be infected and the others don't want to be infected. So if I were you, I would all buy a house in the countryside, far away from any place. The last observation I'd like to make is obviously it's a tremendous economic sophism to believe that you can print your way into prosperity when all the evidence is against it.
Watch the dollar, watch for a panic there. If it gets out of control, you'll see massive dumping of dollars. The Fed will be intervening even more than it is now. People are going to be turning over dollars as quickly as they can. They're not going to want to hold them. Prices will skyrocket.
I think the final crisis will happen, and you can just postpone a crisis, but eventually you have a major crisis. And I really believe 2008, the financial system went bust. Next train station will be when governments will go bust. And I think in the Western world, they'll all go bust. Before they go bust, they'll print money and they go to war. So everything will be, and all of us will be doomed. Thank you for your attention.
The following is a fictional story of events that may happen in the near future. 8 a.m. New York Stock Exchange. It's a cold, breezy day on Wall Street as markets await the Federal Reserve's announcement for QE4. Futures are up significantly. The Dow Jones just breached its 2008 high of 14,164. Gold just hit an all-time high of 2,900. Silver just breached $100 per ounce. The dollar index is holding at 53. With official unemployment at 16.3%, there is a nervous feeling on Wall Street that if this doesn't work, the world could implode into a depression that will last for the remainder of the decade. 8:19 a.m. Beijing. Chinese officials announced that they can no longer allow Washington to devalue their holdings. After making their concerns private, China accepts that Washington will never stop paying its debts with inflated currency. China makes an official statement from Beijing, quote, "We have made our concerns known privately for some time. With QE4 about to be announced today, China will have no choice but to stop purchasing U.S. treasuries. We have allowed Washington to try to work through their imbalances for 4 years. But with global inflation and U.S. consumers rapidly shrinking as a percentage of global GDP, we feel that a Western recovery is unlikely until they reform their entitlement programs. 8:45 a.m. New York Stock Exchange. Upon hearing the statement from China, Dow futures have a sharp reversal and begin to drop. Gold leaps past $3,000 per ounce, up $150 per ounce in the last 26 minutes. CNBC awaits a statement from the White House. 8:50 a.m. Washington, D.C. The president makes an official statement to calm investors' fears. He tells Americans that he has spoken with several G20 leaders. They have assured him that they will continue to increase their purchase of treasuries and believe that a strong U.S. economy is the only thing that will bring back global prosperity. He has also spoken to Chairman Bernanke, who assures him that a strong dollar will be the result of QE4. The president also reminds Americans that his recent New Deal recovery programs that he passed through executive order will increase the likelihood of a lasting recovery. He also notes that Beijing, since 2009, has slowly been reducing their holdings, so the impact will be minimal. 9:51 a.m. New York. Dow futures fall 850 points in the first 20 minutes of trading. Markets are halted for 1 hour by the authorities. 10 a.m. Main Street, America. The news about the stock market in China has now spread. A panic begins to set in and unprepared Americans rush to the grocery store. In an attempt to purchase food and water, Americans that didn't know what was going on are alerted by all of the news stories and panic buying. Within 50 minutes, there is a nationwide rush to the stores. Empty store shelves in America become a reality. 10:52 a.m. New York. Markets reopen and the Dow Jones resumes its collapse. Investors around the world join the sell-off in bonds and stocks and begin to purchase commodities. Unlike the panic of 2008, this time commodities are seen as the only safe haven from a dollar crisis. 11:30 a.m. New York. The Dow falls 1,700 points since reopening. Trading is halted for at least 2 hours. The Federal Reserve injects $200 billion into the markets and announces that QE4 will be delayed until further notice. Congress is called back to D.C. for an emergency joint session. Some members of Congress are saying that they consider China's statement a financial attack. 12 p.m. Main Street, America. Several cities begin to see civil unrest after grocery stores are forced to close. Traffic in the streets and violence break out. The president puts the National Guard on alert for a possible deployment onto U.S. streets if things don't get under control soon. Several news agencies are reporting injuries at grocery chains and call for the authorities to do something before it gets worse. 12:15 p.m. Toronto, Canada. George Soros tells CNBC that a run on treasuries is imminent and that there is nothing the government can do to stop it. He says it is unfortunate that a controlled decline of the dollar was not coordinated better over the years. Today really could have been avoided if not for the Tea Party politicians who demanded fiscal responsibility and a constitutional government. 3 p.m. Gold closes at $11.53 for the day at $4,053 per ounce. Silver closes at $173 per ounce. The president announces that due to civil unrest in some areas of the country, U.S. stock markets will remain closed for the rest of the day. With the exception of mining and other inflation-related stocks, the majority of U.S. stocks are down significantly due to the sell-off and flight to safety in commodities. The Federal Reserve announces that it will begin to purchase U.S. treasuries and stocks in order to stabilize the markets. But this only feeds investors' fears of a full-blown treasury run and collapse of the dollar. 6 p.m. Asia. Asian markets begin a massive sell-off. Dollar collapse rumors begin to take hold of the markets. CNBC Asia looks into a possible COMEX default and complete breakdown in the U.S. economy. Gold spikes in Asia, up 17.50 in the first complete hour of trading. Gold is now at 58.03. 7 p.m. Gold and silver bullion dealers across the world have suspended all sales due to no inventory. A COMEX default is now expected. Several central bank representatives propose a freeze on currency markets and a fixed devaluation of the U.S. dollar in order to calm investors. 7:30 p.m. The United States. The sun sets on America. In the last 12 hours, the world has changed. Americans are glued to their televisions, taking a crash course on a debauched currency. Smoke from fires in the cities have put a dark cloud over the nation. 7:45, the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve announces it will inject $1.5 trillion into the markets in order to stop any further decline in stocks. 7:55 p.m., OPEC. the final nail in the coffin. OPEC nations halt oil trades in US dollars until further notice. They will only accept euros, renminbi, or gold. 7:59 p.m. The Federal Reserve's announcement to inject $1.5 trillion into the markets causes a sharp reversal in overseas markets. Stocks begin to rally even as Main Street melts down.
It's impossible to predict the time when confidence will be lost, but it can come quickly. Resorting to buying other paper currencies will not be of much help. When the dollar crashes, most likely the purchasing power of all currencies, since all currencies hold dollars as a reserve, will go down as well. This means that dollars and other currencies will go into buying consumer items, precious metals, and other physical properties. Consumer prices will soar, as well as interest rates. The central bank will lose control, and the more they inflate, the worse the confidence becomes. The interest rates will respond to these efforts by rising sharply. If the Fed tries to reverse the run on the dollar, interest rates will also soar, and the pain on the American citizens will be of such proportion that political chaos will result. Either scenario leads to political and social chaos, the third event, and the most dangerous. With no ability of the federal government to fund its commitments, international or domestic, major changes will occur in our system. The social unrest will elicit cries for government to exert unusual force to head off a complete breakdown of law and order. The ultimate trap will be set for a system of government claiming to protect a free society. If more power and police authority are not given to the federal government, it will be argued that only anarchy will result. If more government policing power is given, it will mean a lethal threat to civil liberties. Already, we have permitted the notion that a single person, the Attorney General or the President, can decide who is an enemy combatant, thus denying that individual the right of habeas corpus, permitting indefinite detentions without charges made. This attitude towards civil liberties has changed significantly since the fear built around 9/11. Yes, I know, declaring one an enemy combatant is reserved only for the radical Muslims engaged in terrorism against the United States. To be reassured by this reasoning is quite dangerous and naive. Logic should not lead us to equate suspects with terrorists and include American citizens, and yet this has already been set by precedent. Under difficult circumstances, our political leaders will not be hesitant to use these powers to maintain order. Tragically, the people may even demand it. We are rapidly moving toward a dangerous time in our history. Society as we know it is vulnerable to political and social unrest. This impending crisis comes as a consequence of our flawed foreign and domestic economic policies, a silly notion about money, ignorance about central banking, and ignoring the onerous power and mischief of out-of-control intelligence agencies. Our unsustainable welfare state and a willingness to sacrifice privacy and civil liberties in an attempt to achieve safety and security from an inept government. Dangerous times indeed. What can be done about it? Must we wait for the inevitable and expect to restore our liberties in a street fight against the overwhelming power of the state? Not a good option. The only way that we can prevent blood from running in the streets is to offer a better idea of the proper role of government in a society that desires first and foremost liberty. And that is impossible without a firm commitment by our thought leaders to the ideas of freedom, the source of all creative energy and prosperity. An all-powerful state is the threat to that ideal. The prevailing attitude of the people, as it once was in early America, must be that of liberty and self-reliance, rather than the nanny state and dependency. Rely on the government's force to mold all private choices. If this is understood, a smooth, although not painless, transition to a free society is achievable. Ignoring this option will be very destructive to everything that is dear to the hearts of most Americans. What is it that we must do? We must immediately embark on balance the budget by reducing spending, change our foreign policy to that of non-intervention, a full audit and more supervision of the Federal Reserve, leading to abolishing the Federal Reserve, legalize competition to the Federal Reserve with competing currencies, regain respect for civil liberties and privacy while reining in the CIA, wean ourselves off the dependence of wealth transfers by government, Abolish crony capitalism. No subsidies, no bailouts, no regulatory or tax privileges to protect the powerful elite, especially the military-industrial complex. Eliminate the income tax, the inheritance tax, and taxes on savings and dividends. None of this can happen without the restoration of Congress to its dominant position of the three branches of government, as was originally intended by the Constitution. The executive and the judicial must be reined in, and Congress must assert its prerogatives over all legislation curtailing all unconstitutional agenda through budgetary controls. Signs abound that angry Americans are now more ready than ever before for a change in direction that is indeed real. If this program were improvised, even suddenly and dramatically, the adjustment, though significant and to a degree somewhat painful, would be much shorter and of minor consequence compared to the chaos and poverty that will result if we refuse to change our gluttonous appetite for a free lunch.
And that means your life is your own, it's not somebody else's, and you have a right to do with your life what you want, and you ought to have the right to keep the fruits of all your labors.
Robert Nozick developed something called the Tale of the Slave. It's very brief, goes through 9 quick stages. Nozick invites you to imagine yourself as the slave in the story. Stage 1 is that you are indeed a slave subject to a brutal master who forces you to work for him and who beats you arbitrarily. In the second stage, the master lightens up a bit, and he beats you only for breaking the rules, and he even grants you some free time. In the third stage, we add the additional dimension that you are one of a group of slaves subject to this master. And this master, based on principles that are acceptable to all of you, decides how goods will be allocated among you. In the fourth stage, you even get some time off. You have to work for the master for only 3 days per week. The other 4 days are your own. In stage 5, you even get to work wherever you want, but you have to remit to the master 3/7 of your wages to correspond to the 3 days out of 7 that you once worked for him. He also retains the right to recall you into service in emergencies and to increase at any time the fraction of your wages to which he lays claim. Then, in stage 6, everyone, all let's say 10,000 slaves, except you, are granted the right to vote. So they get to decide what is allowed and what is not allowed. They get to decide what fraction of your wages will be taken away and what outlets the money will be spent on. In stage 7, you still don't have the right to vote, but you are allowed to try to persuade those who can vote to exercise their powers in a particular way. In stage 8, you are granted the right to vote, but only to break a tie. You write down your vote, and if a tie should occur, your vote is opened up and recorded. No tie has ever occurred. Finally, in stage 9, you are fully granted the right to vote. But this simply means, functionally, that as in stage 8, in case of a tie, your vote carries the issue. But there has never been a tie. Nozick's question is this: at what stage between 1 and 9 did this become something other than the tale of a slave? That's the kind of mind-blowing question that makes you rethink everything you've been taught about taxation and society, government. It's the kind of thing that makes you skeptical of government propaganda from that moment on. And that's precisely why Nozick's question is never asked.
If the assumption is made that the government has control over your income, whether it's 1% or 99%, the principle is 100%, the government has control. So if they permit you to keep a certain percentage, they're in the driver's seat. And of course our taxes vary a lot and they're hidden. But the average American works now half the time, to pay their taxes, and they're getting less for it every year because of the economic problems that we face. So I don't like it because of the assumption. Of course, the other reason I despise it is because of the way it's collected. We are required as individuals to literally become slaves to the government by reporting endlessly reams and reams of personal financial information that in a free society would be your own business. And then if the IRS comes and they challenge us, you know, for our tax return, the assumption is you're guilty, and you don't have regular court. You go to a tax court. You have to prove yourself innocent. So it puts our whole Constitution on its head, and I think it's terrible economics. It really does not conform with the Constitution, and it ultimately destroys the productive capacity of this country.
Imagine you have a friend called George. You've been friends since childhood. Although you're not as close as you were back then, you still see each other once in a while and get along very well. One day, you and George are approached by an old mutual friend, Oliver. Oliver explains that he's had a run of bad luck and is raising money to cover tuition fees for his kids. You want to help Oliver out, so you give him some money. To your surprise, George doesn't offer Oliver any help. You try to persuade him, but it's no use. Imagining yourself in this situation, do you think it's okay to threaten to use physical force against George to get him to do the right thing? Now imagine a slightly different situation. This time, a group of your friends take a vote. 6 out of 10 are in favour of threatening George to get him to help Oliver. Does this democratic process make it okay to threaten George? One last change to the situation. This time, imagine that many thousands of people have democratically agreed that a group, who we'll call the agents, should do whatever is necessary to take money from George and give it to Oliver's family. The agents don't explicitly threaten George at first. All they do is send him a bill. Like everyone else, though, George knows what will happen if he doesn't pay the bill. First, he'll get more letters demanding payment, and the bill will get bigger. Eventually, if he still doesn't pay, agents with guns will break into his house and take him away against his will. Almost everyone pays the bills without protest. They know the agents are prepared to use as much force as necessary to overpower you if you resist. Do you think it's acceptable for the agents to threaten violence against George if he doesn't give his money towards helping Oliver's family? If we approve of state programs that redistribute wealth, we must also approve of threats of violence made against peaceful individuals, because this is how the funds are collected. On the other hand, most of us feel uncomfortable about threatening peaceful people when we imagine having to make the threats ourselves. If we feel negatively towards the idea of threatening George personally, can we really be comfortable with the threats made against him by agents of the state? Some people believe that voluntary interaction and spontaneous order are realistic and preferable alternatives to state coercion as a way of organizing society. Do a web search for some of these terms if you're interested in learning more.
Congressman Paul, Pete from Rochester Hills, Michigan, wants to ask you this. If you were president, would you work to phase out the IRS?
Immediately.
That's what they call a softball.
And you can only do that if you change our ideas about what the role of government ought to be. If you think the government has to take care of us from cradle to grave, and if you think our government should police the world and spend hundreds of billions of dollars on a foreign policy that we cannot manage, you can't get rid of the IRS. But if you want to lower taxes, and if you want the government to quit printing the money to come up with shortfall and cause all the inflation, you have to change policy.
I mean, first of all, the income tax is probably the worst way for a government to raise money. It is the most inefficient, ineffective, intrusive tax system that you can have. And certainly, ideally, the best thing to do would be completely abolish the income tax, repeal the 16th Amendment, make sure that it never reared its ugly head again. I mean, number one, it's very intrusive. Think about all the information you have to disclose to the federal government in order to pay the income tax. You have absolutely no privacy once you pay your income taxes. And what about the hassle of it? What about the record keeping? You know, I had to do my taxes today, but of course I didn't do it myself. I paid an accountant a lot of money to do my taxes. Just about everybody pays accountants. Why? Because it's so complicated, nobody can understand it. There's an entire industry of accountants. All they do is prepare and file tax returns. What a complete waste of our resources. We need those resources to be freed up for more productive uses. I own a brokerage firm. A lot of my clients have IRAs, Roth IRAs, pensions. Why do these types of accounts exist? Because if you have that type of account, you can avoid some income taxes. So all these complicated structures only exist to avoid a tax that we shouldn't even have in the first place. So if we can abolish the income tax, we can abolish all the armies of accountants, the lawyers, all the time and effort that it takes us to keep our records, compile our records. And of course, when we file the income tax return, after it's done, we sign under penalty of perjury that it's all true and complete. And then the government can use all that information against us and potentially fine us or imprison us if the information turns out to have been false. That is not a way to run a tax system. We would be much better off taxing consumption. Because, of course, you get less of what you tax and more of what you subsidize. And the Internal Revenue Code taxes hard work. It taxes savings. It taxes investment. So we get less of it. It subsidizes debt, borrowing. You can take a write-off for interest, for example, on a home mortgage. So we're encouraging borrowing, which is what we don't want to do. So we want to go to a consumption-based tax. Let's tax people when they spend their money, not when they're earning their money. Now, I heard somebody on, I think it was on CNN or CNBC today, arguing against a consumption tax because they said it wasn't fair, that it wasn't progressive, because it's going to hurt the poor more than the rich, because the poor spend all their money and the rich only spend a portion of their money. Well, first of all, sure, the poor spend most of their money, but a lot of the money that they spend, the poor spend a lot of money on food. They spend much higher percentage of their income on food than do the rich, and most national sales taxes would exempt food and a lot of the basic necessities. But number two, let's think about this for a minute. Let's say a rich person earns $1 million a year, and let's say they only spend $200,000. Now the argument is, well, that's not fair because he's only going to pay taxes on $200,000. He's not paying taxes on $800,000. Well, let's think about what he's doing with that $800,000, because we know what he's not doing. He's not spending it. So he's not enjoying any of the money. He's not spending it on himself. So what could he be doing with that money? Well, one thing he could be doing with it is donating some of it to charity. Anything wrong with that? Do we want to punish somebody for donating to charity? I'd rather see a charity get the money than the government. Obviously, when a charity spends money, 90% of the money they spend goes to the charitable causes. When we do charity through the federal government, we lose most of the money to pay for the government bureaucracy. Now, beyond charity, what else might he have done? Well, the only other option is that the money was saved in a bank account. He used it to buy bonds. He invested it in a company. He bought stock. But what are these things doing? When you save your money, when you invest your money, you're growing the economy. You're providing capital. You are creating businesses. You are leading to production of goods, providing services. You're creating employment opportunities. Why would we want to tax that? Why would we want to diminish that? You see, if we're going to tax that money that otherwise would have been saved or invested, we're simply taking money that would have gone into growing the economy and we're giving it to the government instead. I'd rather have that money invested. Now, some people say, well, it's not fair because they're earning all that money and not paying taxes, but they're not spending it. They're not enjoying it. They're letting other people use it. Now, of course, whatever money the rich save today or invest today is going to get spent tomorrow. After all, that's why the rich are investing, to get richer, so that in the future they can spend even more money. And that's when we'll tax them, when they spend it, when they enjoy their money, when they use it for themselves. But when they're making it available to the market, to the country, for capital investment, for job creation, why would we want to tax that money? That's the beauty of a consumption tax. See, all the income is eventually going to be consumed. Let's not tax it until it's consumed, because until it's consumed, it is being used to grow the economy. Let's say that that person that I just mentioned that earned $1 million and only spent $200,000, if they invested $800,000, let's say eventually that $800,000 investment went into growing a business that provided jobs and produced products, and ultimately that $800,000 turned into $8 million. Now, when that $8 million is spent, the government is going to collect much more taxes than if the $800,000 had been spent instead of being invested. And in the meantime, the economy missed out on the benefit of all the productivity, of all the jobs that were created because that rich individual didn't spend his money. Now, of course, if there's another individual who's rich and earns $1 million and decides to spend every penny, you know, on wine and women and fancy cars and travel, then let him pay taxes because he's spending that money on himself. I mean, that's fine, he earned it, but let's tax somebody when they enjoy their wealth. When they use their wealth for the benefit of other people, which is what happens when you make an investment, let's not inhibit that. That is going to grow the economy. That's going to benefit the economy. That is not a reason to oppose a consumption tax. That is specifically why we want to embrace and encourage the adoption of a consumption tax. Now, that being said, the last thing that we want is a national sales tax or a national value-added tax on top of the current income tax. That's the worst of both worlds. We don't want to do that. We want to have a consumption tax only if it replaces the income tax. And of course, I don't want to replace all the revenue. I think taxes are too high. I'd like a consumption tax that raised less revenue than the current income tax because I want to slash government spending. But you know what? If we adopted a consumption-based tax system, the government wouldn't have to spend as much money because the economy would be in much better shape. There'd be a lot fewer people unemployed, so people wouldn't be collecting unemployment benefits. You know, it would be a richer, more vibrant economy. And so the tax base would be broader and bigger. And so that would help. So in addition to getting out from under the privacy intrusions, you know, when you pay a sales tax or a value-added tax, and I prefer a sales tax because it's more transparent, and that means Congress is less likely to raise it because you can see it better. But you don't have to surrender your constitutional rights. You don't have to, you know, give up all your privacy. You don't have to hire accountants and lawyers. You don't have to risk going to jail. You just buy a product and you pay the tax. It's very simple. It's how the founding fathers envisioned that the federal government would raise money, and that's exactly the type of tax system that I would like to restore if at all possible. Anyway, thanks everybody for listening, and I will blog again soon. Take care.
Some people would say, yes, but you don't care about the people who will fall through the cracks. Well, maybe I do. Maybe I don't want to see hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people losing their houses as they are today, falling through the cracks. Maybe we who believe in freedom and the free market and sound money care a whole lot about runaway inflation and unemployment and all the problems that are generated by central banking and Congress people who are always passing more laws and rules that are interfering with the marketplace. I believe personally and sincerely that a truly compassionate person, if they understand economics, they have to believe in liberty and the free market and private property rights.
The big government progressives in both the Democratic and the Republican parties have been trying to trick us. These folks who really want the government to care for us from cradle to grave have been promoting the idea that health care is a right. They have succeeded in moving the debate from whether the feds should micromanage health care to how the feds should micromanage health care. This is a false premise, and we should reject it. Health care is not a right, it is a good, like food, like shelter, and like clothing. Okay, what's a right? A right is a gift from God that extends from our humanity. Thinkers from St. Thomas Aquinas to Thomas Jefferson to the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to Pope John Paul II have all argued that our rights are a natural part of our humanity. We own our bodies, thus we own the gifts that emanate from our bodies. So our right to life, our right to develop our personalities, our right to think as we wish, to say what we think, to publish what we say, our right to worship or not worship, our right to travel, to defend ourselves, to use our own property as we see fit, our right to due process, which is fairness from the government, and our right to be left alone are all rights that stem from our humanities. These are natural rights that we were born with. The government doesn't give them to us, and the government doesn't pay for them, and the government can't take them away unless a jury finds that we have violated someone else's rights. What is a good? A good is something we want or need. In a sense, it is the opposite of a right. We have our rights from birth, but we need our parents when we are children, and we need ourselves as adults to purchase the goods we require for existence. So food is a good, shelter is a good, clothing is a good, education is a good, a car is a good, legal representation is a good, working out at the gym is a good, and access to health care is a good. Does the government give us goods? Well, sometimes it takes money from us and gives that money to others. You can call that taxation or you can call it theft, but you cannot call it a right. A right stems from our humanity. A good is something you buy or someone else buys for you. Now, when you look at health care for what it is, when you look at the U.S. Constitution, when you look at the history of human freedom, when you accept the American value of the primacy of the individual over the fleeting wishes of the government, it becomes apparent that those who claim that health care is a right simply want to extend a form of government welfare. Now, when I make this argument to my big government friends, they come back at me with, well, if people don't have health insurance, they will just go to hospitals and we'll end up paying for them anyway. Well, why should that be? We don't let people steal food from a supermarket or an apartment from a landlord or clothing from a local shop. Why do we let them take health care from a hospital without paying for it? Well, my big government friends contend that's charity. Well, they're wrong again. It's impossible to be charitable with someone else's money. Charity comes from your own heart, not from the government spending your money. When we pay our taxes to the government and it gives that money away, that's not charity, that's welfare. When the government takes more from us than it needs to secure our freedoms so it can give some of that money away, that's not charity, that's theft. And when the government forces hospitals to provide free health care to those who can't or won't care for themselves, that's not charity, that's slavery. That's why we now have constitutional chaos, America, because the government steals and enslaves. And we outlawed that a long time ago.
Our government has been mismanaging medical care for more than 45 years. For every problem it has created, it has responded by exponentially expanding the role of government. Here are some points I'd like to have my colleagues consider. Number one, no one has a right to medical care. If one assumes such a right, it endorses the notion that some individuals have a right to someone else's life and property. This totally contradicts the principles of liberty. Number two, if medical care is provided by government, this can only be achieved by an authoritarian government unconcerned about the rights of the individual. Number three, economic fallacies accepted for more than 100 years in the United States has deceived policymakers into believing that quality care can come only by only can be achieved by government force, taxation, regulations, and bowing to a system of special interests that creates a system of corporatism. Number four, more dollars into any monopoly run by government never increases quality, but it always results in higher costs and prices. Number 15, there must be more competition for individuals entering into the medical field. Licensing strictly limits the number of individuals who can provide patient care.
A lot of problems were created in the 20th century as a consequence of the Flexner Report in 1910, which was financed by the Carnegie Foundation and strongly supported by the AMA. Many medical schools were closed, and the number of doctors were drastically reduced. The motivation was to close down medical schools that catered to women, minorities, and especially homeopathy. We continue to suffer from these changes, which were designed to protect physicians' income and promote allopathic medicine over the more natural cures and prevention of homeopathic medicine. Number 16, we must remove any obstacle for people seeking holistic and nutritional alternatives to current medical care. We must remove the threat of further regulations pushed by the drug companies now working worldwide to limit these alternatives. True competition in the delivery of medical care is what is needed, not more government meddling. A matter of fact, if you look at every single problem we're facing today, it's because of the lack of respect for the rule of law and the Constitution. The answers can be found in the return to the rule of law and a strict interpretation of the Constitution.
When Benjamin Franklin exited the Constitutional Convention, he was asked by a woman, "Sir, what have you given us?" His immediate response was, "A republic, ma'am, if you can keep it." Yet most Americans today have been persuaded that our nation's governmental system is a democracy and not a republic. The difference between these two is essential in understanding Americanism and the American system. Before we discuss political systems, however, it's helpful to address the confusion that has been spread about the political spectrum. Many have been led to believe that the political spectrum places groups such as communists on the far left, fascists or dictators on the far right, and political moderates or centrists in the middle. However, a more accurate political spectrum will show government having zero power on the far right to having 100% power on the far left. At the extreme right, there is no government. The extreme left features total government under such labels as communism, socialism, Nazism, fascism, princes, potentates, dictators, kings, any form of total government. Those who claim that Nazis and fascists are right-wing never define their terms. This amounts to spreading confusion. Toward the middle of the political spectrum can be found the type of government limited to its proper role of protecting the rights of the people. That's where the Constitution of the United States is. Those who advocate such a form of government are really constitutional moderates. So let's analyze the basic forms of government. They are monarchy or dictatorship ruled by one, oligarchy ruled by a few, democracy ruled by a majority, republic ruled by law, and anarchy, which is ruled by no one. In discussing these five, we'll see that they can be narrowed down to even fewer. Looking first at monarchy or dictatorship, this form of government doesn't really exist in the practical sense. It's always a group that puts one of its members up front. A king has his council of nobles or earls, and every dictator has his bureaucrats or commissars, the men behind the scenes. This isn't ruled by one, even though one person may be the visible leader. It's ruled by a group. So let's eliminate monarchy, dictatorship, because it never truly exists. Oligarchy, which is ruled by a group, is the most common form of government in all history. And it is the most common form of government today. Most of the nations of the world are ruled by a powerful few, and therefore oligarchy remains. At the other end, we find anarchy, which means without government. Some people have looked over history and found that many of its worst crimes were committed by governments, so they decided that having no government might be a good idea. But this is a mistake, because as the ancient Greeks stated, without law there can be no freedom. Our founding fathers agreed and held that some amount of government is a necessary force in any civilized, orderly society. In a state of anarchy, however, everyone has to guard life, liberty, and property, and the lives of family members. Everyone must be armed, and movement is severely restricted because one's property has to be protected at all times. Civilized people have always hired someone to do the guarding, a sheriff, a police force, or some branch of government. Once law enforcement was in place, the people were freer. They could leave their property, work in the fields, and so on. In short, the proper amount of government makes everyone freer. There are some who advocate anarchy, however, not because they want no government, but because they don't like what they have. They use anarchy as a tool for revolutionary change. The condition of anarchy is very much like a vacuum where something rushes in to fill it. These calculating anarchists work to break down the existing government with rioting, killing, looting, and terrorism. Tragically, the people living in such chaos often go to those best able to put an end to it and beg them to take over and restore order. And who is best able to put an end to the chaos? The very people who started it. The anarchists who created the problem then create a government run by them, an oligarchy, where they have total power. This is exactly what happened in Russia that led to Lenin taking total power, and in Germany where Hitler's brown shirts created the chaos that brought him to power. But anarchy isn't a stable form of government. It's a quick transition from something that exists to something desired by the power-hungry. It's a temporary condition, and because it isn't permanent, we eliminate it as well. The word democracy comes from two Greek words, demos, meaning people, and kratein, meaning to rule. Democracy, therefore, means the rule of the people, majority rule. This, of course, sounds good, but suppose the majority decides to take away one's home, or business, or children. Obviously, there has to be a limit. The flaw in democracy is that the majority isn't restrained. If more than half the people can be persuaded to want something in a democracy, they rule. What about republic? Well, that comes from the Latin, res meaning thing, and publica meaning public. It means the public thing, the law. A true republic is one where the government is limited by law, leaving the people alone. America's founders had a clean slate to write on. They could have set up an oligarchy. In fact, there were some who wanted George Washington to be their king. But the founding fathers knew history, and they chose to give us the rule of law in a republic, not the rule of a majority in a democracy. Why? Let's demonstrate the difference in the setting of the Old West. Consider a lynch mob in a democracy. 35 horseback riders chase one lone gunman. They catch him, and they vote 35-1 to hang him. Democracy has triumphed, and there's one less gunman to contend with. Now consider the same scenario in a republic. The 35 horseback riders catch the gunman and vote 35-1 to hang him, but the sheriff arrives, and he says, "You can't kill him. He's got his right to a fair trial." So they take the gunman back to town. A jury of his peers is selected, and they hear the evidence and the defense, and they decide if he shall hang. Does the jury even decide by majority rule? No, it has to be unanimous or he goes free. The rights of the government aren't subject to majority rule but to the law. This is the essence of a republic. Many Americans would be surprised to learn that the word democracy does not appear in the Declaration of Independence or the U.S. Constitution. Nor does it appear in any of the constitutions of the 50 states. The founders did everything they could to keep us from having a democracy. James Madison, rightly known as the father of the Constitution, wrote in essay number 10 of the Federalist Papers, "Democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property, and have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths." Alexander Hamilton agreed, and he stated, "We are a republican government. Real liberty is never found in despotism or in the extremes of democracy." Samuel Adams, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, stated, "Democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself." The founders had good reason to look upon democracy with contempt, because they knew that the democracies in the early Greek city-states produced some of the wildest excesses of government imaginable. In every case, they ended up with mob rule, then anarchy, and finally tyranny under an oligarchy. During that period in Greece, there was a man named Solon, who urged creation of a fixed body of law not subject to majority whims. But where the Greeks never adopted Solon's wise counsel, the Romans did. Based on what they knew of Solon's laws, they created the 12 tables of the Roman law and in effect built a republic that limited government power and left the people alone. Since government was limited, the people were free to produce, with the understanding that they could keep the fruits of their labor. In time, Rome became wealthy and the envy of the world. In the midst of plenty, however, the Roman people forgot what freedom entailed. They forgot that the essence of freedom is the proper limitation of government. When government power grows, people freedom recedes. Once the Romans dropped their guard, power-seeking politicians began to exceed the powers granted them in the Roman constitution. Some learned that they could elect politicians who would use government power to take property from some and give it to others. Agriculture subsidies were introduced, followed by housing and welfare programs. Inevitably, taxes rose and controls over the private sector were imposed. Soon, a number of Rome's producers could no longer make ends meet, and they went on the dole. Productivity declined, shortages developed, and mobs began roaming the streets, demanding bread and circuses from the government. Many were induced to trade freedom for security. Eventually, the whole system came crashing down. They went from a republic to a democracy, and ended up with an oligarchy under a progression of the Caesars. Thus, democracy itself is not a stable form of government. Instead, it is the gradual transition from limited government to the unlimited rule of an oligarchy. Knowing this, we as Americans are ultimately left with only two choices. We can keep our republic, as Franklin put it, or we will inevitably end up with an oligarchy, a tyranny of the elite.
We have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order, a world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founders.
I think that we are really at the beginning of a very different era. 1944, the great minds of the world, Dexter White, John Maynard Keynes, and a bunch, essentially laid the foundations for the Bretton Woods institutions in the United Nations. And they built a system which functioned for over 50 to 60 years. I think that it's time to renew that vision. A very different world than one that they did, of independent nation states who simply came together but could ignore essentially what was going on inside those countries. That day is over, thanks to Alan Locke. I think we've got to take it one step further. And we've got to say that, in fact, countries have responsibilities to their neighbors. And their neighbors are in every nook and cranny of the world. And I believe that that is going to become the debate of our generation.
I think a new world order is emerging, and with it the foundations of a new and progressive era of international cooperation.
We're all going to have to give up a little bit of our sovereignty in order to make the world work.
That is essential. I know some people don't like it. It's a loss of national sovereignty, but it is a simple reality. It is a simple reality.
Oil looks higher, gold looks higher, currencies look weaker, all for the reasons that we talked about before. I mean, you've got huge wage disparities. I don't know how that inevitably resolves itself. It may resolve itself in some type of a global currency crisis. And then if the global currency crisis unfolds, then inevitably you get, I guess, an alignment under a global world government, a new global currency, and a new world order. So we may be moving towards that.
Well, people don't call my syndicated show anymore and disagree with that fact, because now in the news they admit, yes, there's a world government, yes, there's a new world order. So let's look at the new world order and what it has in store for you and your family. And I assure you, my friends, it is nothing less than total enslavement.
Well, you know, the fact is that the black helicopter people have been saying that, oh, we're going to do away with the dollar and move towards one world currency. And it's been kind of a key conspiracy theorist idea for a long time. And what I did in the last week or so is really pour myself into the literature on why we might want to have one world currency, and there's some pretty good arguments. I could see us moving towards, as a global financial system, having an alternative to the dollar be the sort of primary unit of account. And Keynes called for this long, long ago, right before the Bretton Woods conference. And it looks like there are a lot of people, including Joe Stiglitz, including the Chinese and the Russians, trying to move in that direction. So I think it's something that really could happen. It's something we need to pay attention to.
But something that would take a long time, right, Kevin?
No, it wouldn't really, because right now what's going on is that developing countries in particular feel like in order to prove to the world that they have the liquidity they need to be stable, that they need to hold a lot of dollars. And if they en masse all decide to hold some other thing, perhaps something issued by the International Monetary Fund, then they could move all that dollar demand to demand for another type of currency. And then once they did that, then it could be that you're going to have a bandwagon effect, and a lot of other countries, including Europe and the U.S., might eventually have to play along.
Can I just, I don't know if you've come across this, Kevin, but some large religions may have a problem with one world currency.
Yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about. But, you know, there are a lot of things that are wrong about the current system and things that Stiglitz has pointed out. So, for example, since the developing world has to hold a lot of dollars in order to prove that they have liquidity, then basically what they're doing is making interest-free loans to the United States. And that's not really just to have the poorest countries on earth, you know, pouring resources to the United States in order to hold dollars. Whereas if something like the International Monetary Fund issued a currency, then maybe those profits from producing the currency that people need to hold in reserve could go back towards the developing world.
Hey, Kevin, will all of this clear once kind of the dust settles? And I mean, I know everybody's worried about deficit, certainly the deficit of the United States, and that's why they're getting even more and more worried about the dollar. But let's assume, you know, the economy gets back on track and things start to improve and the deficit goes down. I mean, won't all this talk just go away?
No, I really don't think so. But I think that you're right that one reason why this talk has really lifted is that the U.S. deficit situation is so terrible that people are a little bit worried that maybe the U.S. dollar isn't going to be the best place to park your money over the next few years. But I think there's this other thing, which is the equity between the developed world and the developing world that needs to be addressed. And so the developing world is throwing capital at the developed world, and really it should go in the other direction.
Are the people, though, that are concerned also concerned because they are holding so many U.S. dollars? I mean, China brings this up, right? But it's not in China's best interest to pull investors out of U.S. dollars either.
Right. So right now, if everybody were to abandon the dollar, then that might be a problem for the value of all of China's assets that are in dollars. But I think that a kind of orderly progression towards using other reserve currencies, maybe the creation of one by the IMF, is something that, whether the U.S. likes it or not, I believe is likely to happen. And so you need to start to think about what's going to happen if the developing world coalesces around the idea that we should have this new currency. Maybe, you know, Keynes called it the Bancor. We'd have this new currency that they all use as their reserve, as their main reserve. If that starts to happen, it's going to be a fundamentally different world, and they've got a strong incentive to do that.
The former chief economist of the World Bank, Mr. Stiglitz, reported that the World Bank and IMF planned to implode the world economy. You see, the globalists print the money. They gain their power out of creating bubbles, then bursting those bubbles, creating depressions and recessions, and getting control of assets, corporations, and private property. The globalists control the boom and bust system. IMF unveils details of a plan for international bankruptcy system. What a scam. They go into third world countries, their documents show, pay off the leadership to not pay their debts, and then to sign over the natural resources and the population themselves, as well as their public lands, as collateral on a debt that the IMF and World Bank printed up off their printing presses at absolutely no cost to them.
Talk to us a little bit more about this currency crisis you see erupting. What does that assume about what's going to happen to the dollar?
Well, it assumes that the dollar will utterly get destroyed and become virtually worthless.
We've also been very clear, as you know, Canada co-chaired the international panel on financial regulation. Our view is that all of these national systems of regulation have to be fixed, but there also has to be international coordination. There has to be an international peer-reviewed process for national regulations.
They call it coordination of regulation. What it really is putting the American economy under international regulation.
The head of the International Monetary Fund, or the private holding company of the central banks of the planet, proposes new reserve currency, an end to the dollar. So we've gone in the last few years from them denying they were planning this, even though we had their internal documents that were leaked, to now proposing it openly. We need to talk about how this is going to shake out, how they plan to unfold this. We'll tie it into what the global government is doing, what they're setting up. Global government for, by, and of the private predatory central banks.
And those people who have been yelling, oh, the UN's going to take over global
conspiracy theorists.
They've been crazy, but now they're right.
Yeah, well, when Geithner said he would be open to the idea of a global currency last week, those conspiracy people had said and suggested that for years. Right. You're not wrong.
But in a globalized economy, we are going to have to take global responsibilities, and there is going to have to be some semblance of global governance on these questions.
Also, we'll tie it into their funding mechanism, the global carbon taxes, the environment tyranny that they're bringing in, the green straitjacket.
I've heard time and time again members here talk of CO2 as a pollutant. A pollutant is a life-giving natural gas. It gives me the impression that some of our members haven't had the benefit of a formal education. Isn't this really just about the state being able to get its hand in ordinary people's trouser pocket to get more tax from them? Isn't this all about political control? Isn't all this about politics and big business? The whole thing's a sham. This bogus hypothesis, this ridiculous nonsense that man-made CO2 is causing global warming. Enough, please, before we damage irrevocably the global economy.
Now we will reveal what Barack Obama and his controllers' true agenda is. Number one, bring the United States under the complete regulatory control of a private offshore superbank known as the Bank of the World. More than 100 new taxes are now being developed under the umbrella of curbing greenhouse gases. The new taxes will be paid directly to the private bank consortium. At the producer level, taxes will be paid on farm animals' flatulence. At the consumer level, there will be carbon taxes on all forms of meat, beef, poultry, pork, and fish. All cars will be fitted with satellite tracking boxes that will tax driving by the mile. And an added tax will be placed on all fossil fuels, including motor oil and natural gas. All plastic products will have a carbon tax added. Outdoor space heaters and fireplaces are to be taxed. All electricity produced by coal-powered plants will be taxed. Under the cap-and-trade system, citizens will be forced to pay taxes on thousands of products to private cap-and-trade services owned by Al Gore and other elitists. There will be taxes on light bulbs, water, trash pickup, air travel, train travel, bus, ship, medicine, steel production, mining, clothing, laundry, asphalt are just a few of the new taxes to be levied.
But to truly transform our economy, to protect our security and save our planet from the ravages of climate change, we need to ultimately make clean, renewable energy the profitable kind of energy. So I ask this Congress to send me legislation that places a market-based cap on carbon pollution and drives the production of more renewable energy in America. That's what we need.
Once the so-called green economy laws are in place, only global megacorporations and their subsidiaries will be allowed to do business. Van Jones, Barack Obama's first green job czar, has stated repeatedly on the record that the new green economy is only a cover for a complete revolution against capitalism and the total redistribution of wealth. But what Van Jones doesn't tell his sad followers is that the elite are bragging that the modern green movement was designed from its creation to destroy the middle class and transfer all wealth into the hands of a super elite. They're not doing this to uplift the poor. No. The goal is to enslave the planet and usher in a new dark age. Every nation on Earth is in the process of, or has already passed, its own set of carbon tax laws and regulations. If their plan is successful,
Every nation on Earth will not only pay tribute to the powerful world government, but every facet of human life will be regulated by the technocratic global planners. Under the carbon tax scheme, China, India, Mexico, and over 150 other nations are exempt from the global tax system. You see, the bankers already own and control the third world. Their final target is the middle class of the West. Once they've dismantled the economies of the United States, Europe, and Japan, they believe no one can stand in their way. In short, the New World Order is a global corporate takeover. In their global corporate state, there is no room for individuality, sovereignty, or independence. Let's look at the policies they're putting in worldwide to fund their new global SDR system, where nations gather these taxes to pay it to the private IMF and World Bank for the privilege of the nations even having money. Prices rise as New Zealand passes emissions trading scheme, exploding. California knew 2 years ago when they raised taxes it would actually kill the economy. They know Kennedy cut taxes by 50% and the tax receipts doubled. They want to bankrupt society. Bloomberg is reporting that 46 state governments are on the verge or have already gone bankrupt. And in California, Schwarzenegger has told 200,000 state employees that they're going to be cut from $20+ an hour to minimum wage, $6 an hour. So all of you people that serve big government, and for all of you that thought that socialism was a good idea, you're now going to find out what it's like to be a third world slave. My friends, it doesn't matter where you're from on the globe. The United States, Nigeria, Japan, Mexico. It doesn't matter. You are under attack by an enemy that is sworn to establish a planetary tyranny. I have read the Trilateral Commission documents from the 70s where they laid out everything they were going to do, and it's now coming to fruition. But do we ever talk about the fact that globalization itself is tyranny? That globalization itself is treason? Globalism is offshore corporations combining forces and pooling their resources to buy off and take over national governments. And once they have control of the British and US and other major Western governments, they take control of our society and use our nations as engines for their global corporate empire. Oh, they wrap it in whatever nation's flag they're using. But this is a global corporate takeover, and it is treason against the nation state. If you watch my film, The Obama Deception, or Fall of the Republic, we cover how the UN is a creation of these private banks and how it's meant to absorb national sovereignty, how the IMF and World Bank in their own documents have wrecked hundreds of third world countries, come in and given them loans that they were not meant to pay back. That's now happening to the United States, England, Europe, and Japan.
We economic hitmen have managed to create the world's first truly global empire, and it's basically a secret empire. We do it many ways, but principally we identify a country that has resources our corporations covet, like oil, arrange a huge loan to that country from the World Bank or one of its sisters. The money never actually goes to the country. It goes to our own corporations to build big infrastructure projects in that country that help a few very wealthy people, but don't benefit the majority of the people who are too poor to buy electricity or have cars to drive on the highways, and yet they're left holding a huge debt that they can't repay. So we go back at some point and say, you can't pay your debts. Give us a pound of flesh. Sell your oil real cheap to our oil companies. Vote with us on the next critical UN vote. Allow us to build a military base in your backyard. Something along these lines. And when we fail, the jackals go in and either overthrow or assassinate these leaders. And if the jackals fail, as they did in Iraq, then we send in the military. I don't think the failure is capitalism. I think it's a specific kind of capitalism where we've developed, we've created what I consider a mutant viral form of capitalism. And this mutant form of capitalism, which I think is really a predatory form of capitalism, has created an extremely unstable, unsustainable, unjust, and very, very dangerous world. I've met a lot of terrorists. I've interviewed them for books. I've never met one who wanted to be a terrorist. They're desperate people. If we want to get rid of terrorism, we must get rid of the root causes, that cancer that is destroying our whole system. because I think it's really important that we understand today we cannot have homeland security unless we understand that the whole planet is our homeland.
What is happening now is bigger than the private Federal Reserve takeover of 1913 in the United States, because it's worldwide. And the things happening in the United States are happening in Greece and in Spain and in Portugal and in Germany and in England and all over the world. The robber barons who have created these trillions and trillions of dollars of derivatives as monetary weapons are engaged in a hostile corporate takeover of the free world. It is happening now. Here is CNN, 2 days after the G20 had concluded its meeting that cost $1.2 billion in Toronto, Canada. They announced in CNN, dollars should be replaced as international standard, UN report says. And they go on to say exactly what I told people a decade ago. They're going to devalue our currencies now, and that they will then create a new SDR, cashless money, between the private banking family. Herman von Rompuy admits the G20 is the global government. We will pay our carbon taxes to the private banking consortium, and we'll still have our local currencies. They'll be devalued, and the super currency will now be this cashless system. Imagine the private banks that have already looted us now are completely transcending nation states that they've already imploded by design and sucked dry. They're literal vampires financially. And now they're creating a new global fraud, a new global cashless system that will control all the other financial systems. So simultaneously, at the international level, the private big six banks, whose front companies are the IMF and World Bank, that's the International Federal Reserve, are calling for them to be able to issue the new global standard of cashless money that all our currencies are based on here in the United States. And this is happening simultaneously in every major nation. But here in the United States, legislation has passed the House and Senate. It's now in conference committee as they merge the bills to, in the words of the Washington Post, give total power to the private Federal Reserve. The private Federal Reserve, that is the holding company of the big six banks here in the United States, is saying, okay, we sold you derivatives, we took the trillions of dollars in the bailout, we won't tell Congress where the money went, now we're going to punish ourselves by giving ourselves even more power. And the Texas Banking Association 2 months ago, their president wrote an editorial and told the truth. He said, look, those big mega banks sold the derivatives. They took over our society. They're the ones consolidating power. This has been written to forcibly take over healthy banks at the state level and regional level and credit unions. And this is a huge power grab. And other mainline publications like Bloomberg have admitted that this is giving the Federal Reserve almost total control. And remember, it is a consortium of private banks. So they're being punished for wrecking our economy by design with even more power. House passes landmark financial reform bill. And when you read this article out of the Washington Post, it's very truthful. But they're spinning it as if this is all good and a solution. House Senate leaders finalized details of sweeping financial overhaul. And they say a new Consumer Protection Bureau housed in the Federal Reserve. This is the fox that killed the hens in the chicken coop. A new Consumer Protection Bureau housed in the Federal Reserve would have independent funding, an independent leader, and near total autonomy to write and enforce rules over the entire economy. The government would have broad new powers. That's the lie. This is not the government. The Federal Reserve is private. To seize and wind down large, failing financial firms, but what they actually do is grab viable firms and feed them into this big six maw, and to oversee the $600 trillion derivatives market. They're finally admitting it's in the hundreds of trillions. Most economists we talk to that are well-respected and have a good track record of analyzing this stuff say it's 1.5 quadrillion or 1,500 trillion. But here's the Washington Post saying that the Federal Reserve is giving total power over the economy to deal with the $600 trillion. Our entire economy is only $14 trillion a year. The Federal Reserve is taking our tax money and giving it to the private central banks, and they won't tell Congress who specifically is getting it. Do you realize the magnitude of this fraud?
But we have the Federal Reserve capable of creating all the money they want with no oversight. They can bail out their friends, but you know, they have the authority, the technically legal authority, not the constitutional authority, the legal authority to give money to foreign governments, give or loan money to foreign central banks or any international financial institution. So therefore, why worry about a Congress? You don't need a Congress if they can do all of this. So I am convinced they're very much involved in foreign policy, over and above what the Congress thinks they're involved with. But there's also other ways that our government is absolutely out of control. In one area, the more I look at it and the more I study it, the more concern I have. And that is the unconstitutional, illegal, outrageous role of our CIA. Average members of Congress can't know what's going on. I can't know everything that's going on because they're not audited either. And they're allowed to earn money in banking. They can own banks. Can you imagine it? The CIA can deal in drugs and have income from drugs and actually be involved. Are they involved in our foreign policy? Not only are they involved in elections of other countries, they can pick and choose and support candidates, and we've been doing it for years, and then they wonder why foreigners disapprove of what we do in the Middle East and around the world. But what about the CIA involvement now in the military operations? You know, it isn't even our military that fights the wars and sends off the drones. It's the CIA in a little room probably in the United States playing war games by drones, sending drones into various countries, even to the extent of picking and targeting certain individuals for assassination. That this administration even goes along with the principle of targeting American citizens for assassination. That is an outrage.
We're not being conquered by foreign armies. We're being conquered by financial fraudsters. Madoff went to jail. These guys are orders of magnitude worse. In fact, many orders of magnitude, and they get total control. And no matter where they meet in the world, at their G20 meetings, the same police state snatch and grab tactics are used because they are in charge. This is corporate government by a bunch of piratical thieves. Have you ever thought about how they're engaged in global domination? That's what globalism is. Here's the worst part. Not only have these mega banks taken over the planet through fraud, their philosophy is eugenics and population reduction. They're only bankrupting the planet and taking it over so they can then put in draconian one-child policies so you and your progeny won't exist in the future. This is full spectrum dominance. We are at a historic crossroads. I've just covered the facts. The United States is sinking deeper into the clutches of these criminals. The entire world is falling deeper into this black hole. It was designed so that it was impossible for any nation to ever survive financially. The globalists have gone way past their fractional reserve banking that gives them an incredible unfair advantage against all other businesses and governments and individuals. They've now gone into derivatives in the last 11 years, and they have created tens of trillions of dollars to take over any institution they wish. The Washington Post admits it's $600 trillion. Ladies and gentlemen, either we stop these fraudsters and wake up now and take action, or they will fully enslave us. They are moving against every nation on earth right now. This is a financial coup d'etat, and what's happening in the United States is happening in every other country simultaneously. These people could care less about you and your family. They are ruthless. You had better wake up and understand they own the Democrats and the Republicans. And unless we have a full awakening to this, we have absolutely no future. Your republic is on its knees, bleeding to death. Please stand up. Please wake up. Please take action today.
If we do our job, we can win this. To me, it is not a political struggle. Politics is secondary to the ideology. We have to change ideology, and that's why the campuses are so important. Ideology, when it becomes a prevailing attitude, it pervades in both parties, or all the parties, and the people endorse it as a whole. And they have endorsed our foreign policy and our economic policy. If we're going to change it, it has to be ideological, and it has to be in that manner to change people's minds. In that case, when the people change their mind, then the politicians can act. Today, if you have just one or two in Washington preaching this or trying to do it, and it's not well received, the people are going to object. But where I am optimistic that more and more people around America are like so many of you, that we're ready to once again live in a free society. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together.
It has been said that when in the course of human events, an oppression so revolts its subjects that it becomes necessary to alter or abolish the means of that tyranny. Is it that time when our Bill of Rights is defiled every day? When our adventures abroad threaten our security at home? When the Federal Reserve keeps our free nation enslaved by debt? When the people of the world tremble under the thumb of corporate imperialism? And now, our nation is drifting dangerously from freedom to fascism. So I have to ask, is it time? Now, the threat is clear. The bands of tyranny are tightening around America, and it is our duty to resist. As empowered patriots, let us take stock of our commitment to the ideals upon which this country was founded. America without her freedoms is like a body without a soul. The challenge before the freedom movement is no less than to bring about a revolution of values, inspire a renaissance of American politics, and breathe new life into the tortured body of our nation. We will meet that challenge with courage and love, and as always, we the people will prevail. To rally the troops of the Revolutionary Army in the winter of 1776, Thomas Paine said, "These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country. But he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Tyranny, like hell, is not easily conquered." As Iraq veterans against the war, we are resisting an occupation we once risked our lives for. We swore to support and defend the Constitution of the United States of America, but we found out the hard way that the greatest enemies of the Constitution are not to be found in the sands of some far-off land, but rather right here at home. Seek out where you can be most effective in the cause of liberty. Challenge our force-fed culture of unquestioning conformity and compliance, and embrace a world that is not defined by the politics of fear, our obedience-producing schools, or the false prophets of the corporate media. As we have been awakened, we must stir the sleeping masses. As the forces of oppression are diligent, so must we toil. As they are committed, we must surpass them. As they step up their efforts, we must rise up to defeat them as a unified movement. Rebels, traitors, enemies of the state, all terms King George would have used to vilify our founders. I, for one, will always rebel against oppression, a traitor only to tyranny, and I would be remiss to not make myself the enemy of a state that so blatantly tramples our freedoms. American values have been nearly vanquished by consumerism, militarism, and authoritarianism. Yellow ribbons and lapel pins will not save this country. When injustice becomes law, resistance becomes duty. The utmost manifestation of love and devotion to America is today, as it always has been, resistance of tyranny. Resist we must, and resist we will. We will not be silent. We will not obey. We will not let our government destroy our humanity. We will not wait another moment in fear to stand up for what we know to be right. It is time we start meeting oppression with resistance. They cannot stop us. Humanity marches on. You can fight it or fight for it. When we say revolution, we say it with love.
But I am asking your help in the tremendous task of informing and alerting the American people. For I have complete confidence in the response and dedication of our citizens whenever they are fully informed. Without debate, without criticism, no administration and no country can succeed, and no republic can survive. That is why the Athenian lawmaker Solon decreed it a crime for any citizen to shrink from controversy. And that is why our press was protected by the First Amendment, the only business in America specifically protected by the Constitution, not primarily to amuse and entertain, not to emphasize the trivial and the sentimental, not to simply give the public what it wants, but to inform, to arouse, to reflect, to state our dangers and our opportunities, to indicate our crises and our choices, to lead, mold, educate, and sometimes even anger public opinion. This means greater coverage and analysis of international news, for it is no longer far away and foreign, but close at hand and local. Confident that with your help, man will be what he was born to be, free and independent.
Now, on Friday noon, I am to become a private citizen. I am proud to do so. I look forward to it. Thank you, and good night.